the morning after the worst storm Hays City, Kansas had ever seen in the autumn of 1873, Jennie Bristol stood in the ruins of her life and did not ask a single soul for help. She stood in the gray, dripping quiet of the aftermath with her boots sinking into mud the color of old rust, looking up at the gaping hole where her roof used to be. Half of it was simply gone. The storm had peeled the eastern side back like the lid of a tin can, leaving the raw timber bones of her rafters exposed to the pale October sky. Rain had soaked through everything. The bed where her husband Thomas had died 14 months ago was ruined, the mattress swollen with water, the floorboards around it dark and warped. The curtains she had sewn herself from flour sacks dyed with indigo were plastered against the broken window frames like wet bandages. 3 of the 4 walls still stood. The 4th leaned outward with the slow theatrical intention of something that had already decided to fall and was only waiting for the right moment to commit. Jennie looked at all of it, pressed her lips together, and did not cry. She was 28 years old. She had wide-set gray eyes the color of a winter creek and dark auburn hair that she kept pinned tightly at her neck because there was no time in her life for anything that was not tightly controlled. She was not a small woman, not fragile the way some of the other wives in town seemed fragile, decorative, and uncertain. She had hands that knew work. She had a back that knew a plow. She had buried a husband and raised 2 children through a Kansas winter on her own reserves of will and very little else, and she had not asked the town of Hays City for a single thing since the funeral. When neighbors brought food, she had not requested, and stood in her kitchen looking at her with that particular expression, half pity and half relief that their own lives were not hers. She hated that expression. She had made a private and unspoken decision on the day she packed Thomas's good boots into a crate and sealed it with a nail that she would never be the woman who wore that expression on someone else's face. So she looked at the ruined roof, and she went to find her children. Clara was 7 and had slept through most of the storm with the extraordinary capacity of the young for unconsciousness. She had spent the night in Jennie's arms in the corner of the house that remained intact, the 2 of them covered with every quilt Jennie owned, while the wind tore at the walls and the rain came in sideways. Silas was 9 and had been pale and wide-eyed throughout, holding his mother's hand with a grip that left crescent marks from his nails in her palm. He was his father's son in the way he held fear inside himself without showing it, jaw clenched, eyes steady, trying very hard to be the man he had been told he would need to be. Jennie found them both at Mrs. Harding's house next door, where Clara was eating cornbread and Silas was sitting on the porch step watching the street with the serious concentration of a sentry. "Is it bad?" Silas asked when he saw his mother come around the corner. "Yes," Jennie said, because she did not lie to her children. "But we have still got 3 walls and the west side of the roof is untouched. We will manage." "The whole east side came off," Silas said. It was not a question. He had seen it. "Yes. Can you fix it?" Jennie looked at her son. He was 9 years old and already carrying weight no child should carry, and she refused to add to it by performing optimism she did not feel. "I will figure it out," she said. "Come eat your breakfast." The town of Hays City had suffered broadly in the storm. It had come out of the northwest with almost no warning, one of those violent autumn fronts that rolled across the Kansas plains like a curtain being yanked from a window, and it had taken with it a barn near the south edge of town, a section of the livery stable roof, the false front of the hardware store, and various smaller devastations distributed across the community with the impartial cruelty of weather. The men of the town gathered in clusters along the main street that morning, surveying damage, making plans, the way men do after a catastrophe, some of them genuinely useful, and some of them expert primarily at standing with their thumbs hooked in their belt loops and talking about what needed to be done. Reverend Calloway organized a work party. It was the kind of thing Reverend Calloway did cheerfully and efficiently, with a ledger book under his arm and a list of priorities ordered by urgency. He went door to door with his deacon, a red-faced man named Percy Birch, collecting names and addresses of those who needed help and those who could provide it. He knocked on Jennie Bristol's door at 9:30. Jennie answered it with flour on her hands because she had already started baking, because the oven still worked, and because bread was something she could do. "Mrs. Bristol," Reverend Calloway said, taking off his hat. He looked past her at the interior of the house, at the rags she had stuffed into the window gaps and the buckets she had positioned under the worst of the leak points. His face moved into that expression. "Lord have mercy. We will absolutely put you on the list. We can have men here by—" "I appreciate the thought, Reverend," Jennie said. "But there are others worse off. The Carmody family lost everything. I still have most of my house. Mrs. Bristol, your roof—" "I am aware of my roof," she said, pleasantly, firmly, in the tone she used when she had made a decision, and the matter was closed. "Please see to the Carmodys first. And the Hendersons, I heard their barn is completely down." Calloway looked at her for a moment with a complicated mixture of admiration and frustration. He had known Jennie Bristol for 2 years, since she and Thomas had come to Hays City from Missouri with their children and their 2 horses, and an iron determination to make something of this particular piece of the plains, and he had watched her become a widow with the same composure she brought to everything, which was to say, a composure that was genuine rather than performed and therefore somehow more difficult to watch than weeping would have been. "You are a stubborn woman," he said. "Yes," Jennie agreed. "I am." "Good morning, Reverend." She closed the door. She spent the morning making an inventory of what needed to be done and how it might be done, and whether she had the means to do it. The answer was not encouraging. The roof needed at minimum 30 feet of new timber, new planking over the exposed joists, and probably new shingles across the entire eastern half. She had some tools. She had no money to speak of, or rather, she had the money she had set aside from selling last season's corn, which she had been saving for a new plow blade and Silas's winter boots, and a second-hand sewing machine she had been watching at the general store for 3 months. The roof would consume all of it, and then some. She could do the labor herself, she thought, or some of it. She was strong and she was not afraid of heights. Thomas had built this house himself and she had worked alongside him, hauling timber and holding boards while he nailed them, handing up tools, learning more than she realized at the time. But she could not do it alone. Even if she could manage the physical demands, which were considerable, she could not hold a board in place and nail it simultaneously without a second pair of hands. She needed someone. She was not going to ask. This was the specific and somewhat maddening particular of Jennie Bristol's pride. The part that she was not always certain was pure strength and not also, somewhere at its root, the fear of being seen as helpless. She had been seen as helpless once after Thomas died, and it had felt like a kind of unclothing, everyone looking at her exposed grief and her uncertain future, and she had resolved to never be in that position again. So she would find another way. She would hire someone, a straightforward transaction with no pity in it, just money for labor if she could afford it, or she would wait. Winter was 6 weeks away, perhaps 8. She could tarp the open sections with the canvas she used to cover the wagon, and she was still making this calculation when Owen Doyle rode into Hays City at just past noon. She didn't see him arrive. She was on the roof at the time. Having climbed up the ladder, she kept behind the barn and begun the preliminary work of assessing exactly what could be salvaged, pulling back the torn sections of shingle and looking at the underlying boards, testing the joists with her weight, moving carefully on the intact portion of the roof while keeping well away from the damaged edge. She had changed into Thomas's old work trousers, which she only wore when there was serious physical work to be done and no one watching, and she had her hair tied back with a length of cord and her sleeves rolled past the elbow. She heard horses on the road. She did not look up. Owen Doyle was 34 years old, which was not particularly old but which showed on him in specific ways, in the set of his shoulders and the stillness of his hands and the particular quality of his eyes, which were the dark amber color of creek water over sandstone, and which had the look of someone who had spent a long time watching large landscapes. He was tall and lean in the way of men who work hard and eat when they can and don't think much about either. He had a week's worth of dark beard and trail dust in his coat, and a bay horse named Calhoun who was good-tempered and steady, which reflected well on his owner. He had come from Dodge City, and before that from Abilene, where he had spent 2 seasons working cattle drives up from Texas, and before that from a dozen other places across the Western Territories. He was not a drifter in the aimless sense. He was a man who had a practical skill set that was useful in a variety of locations, and who had not yet found a location that asked him to stay. He did carpentry work and some blacksmithing and trail work, and anything else that needed doing, and he was good at all of it with the undramatic competence of someone who learned things in order to use them rather than to be admired for knowing them. He rode into Hays City because he had heard there was work to be had after the storm, and because he had been on the road for 3 days and Calhoun needed a rest, and for no more romantic reason than that. He stopped at the livery first, arranged for Calhoun's care, and then walked along the main street taking stock. The storm damage was significant and visible. He saw Reverend Calloway's work party assembled outside the Carmody property on the east end of the street, 6 men with tools and lumber, and he offered his labor, which was accepted without ceremony. He worked through the afternoon helping re-raise the frame of the Carmody barn wall, and by the time the light started to turn, he had established himself as a man who knew what he was doing and who did not require much direction, which are the 2 qualities that matter in a work party. That evening he ate supper at the boarding house, run by a widow named Mrs. Pierce, a brisk and not unkindly woman of 50 who served beans and salt pork and cornbread, and kept her opinions largely to herself except when she did not, which was often. She told him over supper, in the way of someone cataloging the day's events, about the various properties that had been damaged in the storm and which had been attended to and which had not. "Mrs. Bristol won't accept help," Mrs. Pierce said, with a combination of exasperation and something that might have been respect. "Half her roof is gone, and Reverend Calloway tried twice, and she sent him away both times. Got 2 little ones and a dead husband, and she's up there on her own roof like she's got any business being there, which she does not, for all that she's too proud to say so." Owen drank his coffee and didn't say anything. "She's on the property just past the old Hale place going east," Mrs. Pierce continued, addressing this to the table generally. "You can see the damage from the road, plain as anything. Half the shingles blown clean off and one of the joists split from the look of it." Owen said nothing still, but he filed it away. He was up before dawn the next morning. It was not a sudden decision so much as a conclusion that had assembled itself during the night without requiring much deliberation. He was a man who acted on things, who saw a problem and solved it, and a woman with 2 children and a ruined roof 6 weeks before a Kansas winter was a very specific kind of problem. The fact that she had refused help from the town didn't strike him as an obstacle exactly. He was not the town. He was not going to knock on her door and look at her with that expression she apparently hated and offer his services with a condescending formality that required her to accept charity. He was just going to fix the roof. He went to the lumber yard when it opened at first light and had a conversation with the man who ran it, a taciturn Swede named Gustafsson, about what was needed and what it would cost. He spent a portion of his earnings from the previous 2 weeks, the money he had intended to save toward eventually acquiring a piece of land of his own, on timber and planking and a bundle of cedar shingles. He arranged to borrow Gustafsson's wagon to transport the materials. He collected his tools from the boarding house, where he had laid them out on the floor of his room the way he always did, orderly and inventoried, hammer and nails and a good saw and the smaller instruments of the trade. He drove the wagon out to Jennie Bristol's property in the gray pre-dawn quiet when the sky was the color of pewter and the grass was still wet from the storm. He parked in the road in front of the house and sat for a moment looking at it. It was a solid house, Thomas Bristol had known what he was doing. The walls were good limestone block on the lower half, then timber above, the frontier combination that was practical and durable, and even with the storm damage it had the look of a house that was meant to last. The east side of the roof was clearly catastrophic. He could see the raw end of a split joist from the road, pointing at the sky like an accusation. He climbed down from the wagon. He was unloading timber when the front door opened. He did not look up immediately. He was carrying a long plank down from the wagon bed, balancing it with both hands, and looking up would have been impractical. He heard the footsteps stop. He set the plank down against the fence post and straightened and looked. Jennie Bristol stood on her front step in a gray dress with her hair pinned up and an expression on her face that he could not quite classify. It was not the expression of someone who was pleased to see him. It was not the expression of someone who was going to invite him to leave, either. It was somewhere between those two things, complicated and guarded and slightly dangerous. "You are not from the Reverend's work party," she said. "No, ma'am." "Who sent you?" "Nobody." She looked at the wagon. She looked at the timber. She looked at him. "That's cedar shingle," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "That is not cheap." "No, ma'am. I did not ask for help," she said, and the way she said it was not angry exactly, but it had the quality of something that had been stated before and expected to be honored. He met her eyes. They were gray and entirely direct and not easy to look at without flinching, which he did not do. "I know," he said. "I heard that." Then, "Mrs. Bristol," he said, "your roof has a split joist and about 30 feet of open exposure 6 weeks before winter. I am a carpenter. I have the materials and the time. The transaction here is between me and your roof. You don't have to accept anything from me if you'd rather not." He picked up another plank. "But I'm going to fix it either way if you'll allow me on your property." There was a silence. He did not fill it. He had learned early that silences did not always need filling, and that the person who filled them first was often the one who ended up at a disadvantage. "You're staying at Mrs. Pierce's," Jennie said. "Yes. She told you. She mentioned it." Jennie pressed her lips together in a way that conveyed a specific irritation at the nature of small-town information transfer. Then she looked at the timber again, at the materials stacked neatly in the wagon, and he could see the practical side of her mind engaging with the practicality of the situation. "I will feed you," she said finally. "Breakfast and midday meal. That is what I can offer." "You don't need to." "I know I do not need to," she said, with a precision that made clear she was not interested in his opinion on the matter. "I am going to. If you are going to be on my property working, I am going to feed you. That is how I will accept this without it being charity. Do you understand the distinction?" He looked at her for a moment. The sky was brightening behind the house, the early light catching in her hair where it had come loose at her temple, and there was something in her face that was both utterly formidable and entirely genuine, and he thought with a sudden private certainty that he had never met anyone quite like her. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I do." "Good," she said. "My name is Jennie. I don't like ma'am. What do I call you?" "Owen Doyle." "Owen," she said, testing it once matter-of-factly. "I will have breakfast ready in half an hour." She went back inside. He stood there for a moment in the growing light, holding a board with something in his chest that he did not immediately identify, but that was warmer than the October morning warranted. He went to work. He had the supplies organized and his initial assessment of the damage completed before she called him in for breakfast, which was scrambled eggs with dried onion, a slab of salted bacon, and coffee that was good and strong. The children were there. Clara watched him from across the table with the candid fascination of a 7-year-old who had not yet learned to disguise curiosity as politeness. Silas watched him the way his mother did, with that careful gray assessment that was clearly a family trait. "Are you really going to fix the roof?" Clara asked. "Clara," Jennie said. "I am," Owen said. "The whole east side. It was very loud when it broke," Clara said gravely. "I was not scared, though." "She was a little scared," Silas said. "I was not." "You were holding Mama very tight." "That was for warmth," Clara said with enormous dignity. Owen ate his eggs and watched Jennie Bristol move around her kitchen with the unconscious efficiency of someone who operated in this space constantly and knew every inch of it, reaching for things without looking, managing the stove and the children and the morning's logistics simultaneously. And he thought she was the most capable person he had ever been in a room with. After breakfast, he went back to the roof. The work was harder than it looked from the ground, as it always is. The split joist was worse than he had assessed from the road. The wood had cracked at the grain rather than snapping cleanly, and he had to work carefully to remove it without disturbing the adjacent structure. He spent the first part of the morning on demolition, pulling the ruined sections clear, which was both physically demanding and required a kind of patience in the execution, the careful removal of what was broken before the rebuilding could begin. Jennie came out twice to check on what he was doing, the second time climbing partway up the ladder to look at the joist he had removed and make her own assessment. She did not say anything, but he caught her nodding slightly to herself, which he took as approval. Silas came out at noon and stood at the base of the ladder watching. "Can I come up?" the boy asked. "Silas," Jennie called from the doorway. "Not without your mother's permission," Owen said. "Can I, Mama?" Jennie looked at her son and then at the roof and then at Owen, who met her eyes and gave a small, honest shrug that said he would be careful and that the boy clearly wanted to and that it was entirely her call. "Up to the top of the ladder," Jennie said. "Not onto the roof." Silas climbed. He got to the top of the ladder and looked at the work Owen had done, the new joist sitting in its cleaned-out mortise, the fresh timber bright against the old darkened wood. "That's good wood," Silas said. "Cedar," Owen said. "Resists rot and splits clean when it needs to." "My papa used pine," Silas said. "Pine is good too." It was what was available when he built. "This cedar will outlast the house if it's done right." Silas looked at him. "You knew that about our house, that it was pine." "I can see it from up here. The original timber, your father built well. The walls didn't move at all in the storm. Most of the damage was the roof load shifting when the east slope shingles went." The boy was quiet for a moment, processing this, and Owen understood without being told that what Silas was really hearing was that his father had built something that held. "I'll tell Mama," Silas said. "You can tell her that the house is solid," Owen agreed. The boy climbed down. Owen watched him go and felt something complicated, a recognition of the particular specific loneliness of children who were trying to be steady for their mothers, and the tenderness that knowledge produced was not something he expected to feel about a 9-year-old he had met this morning. He worked through the afternoon. The new joists went in well. The planking over them was straightforward once the structure was sound, and he worked methodically and without rushing, making sure each piece was true before moving to the next. Because a roof built in a hurry over a family's home is not a roof worth building. By the time the light started to soften toward evening, he had the joists replaced and most of the planking down, and the open sky above the eastern half of the house was reduced to a narrow strip that could be easily tarped overnight. Jennie came out as he was descending the ladder for the last time that day. She looked up at the roof with her arms crossed over her chest and her expression unreadable. "You have made more progress than I expected," she said. "It was a good day," he said. "Will you finish tomorrow?" "Shingles and finishing work, yes," she nodded. "Will you come in for supper? I made stew." She said it the same way she had said everything else, direct and slightly formal and without any particular warmth in the words themselves, but with something underneath them that was not unfriendly. He hesitated. The boarding house was back in town. He was aware of how things looked, a widow and a stranger, and he was also aware that he had no desire whatsoever to be anywhere other than at this table eating this woman's stew and listening to Clara explain whatever she had been thinking about all day, which would certainly be elaborate. "I'd appreciate that," he said. Clara had been thinking about a crow she had seen that morning that had stolen a piece of hardtack from the front step. She described the crow in remarkable detail over supper, including an analysis of its motivations that Jennie listened to with the steady attention she gave both her children. The same quality of attention Owen noticed she gave to everything, complete and present. The attention of someone who had decided that if she was going to do something, she was going to do it properly. After supper, Silas showed Owen a rock collection he kept on the windowsill, explaining each one with a seriousness that suggested they were not merely rocks, but a carefully curated archive of significant specimens. Owen looked at each one and asked questions that were genuine rather than performed, because rocks were actually interesting when the person explaining them cared about them. And by the time Jennie sent both children to bed, Owen had identified a piece of selenite in the collection that Silas had thought was just a white rock, and that turned out, when held to the lamp, to have the interior luminosity of something frozen in time. "I never knew what that was," Silas said, holding it up and watching the light go through it. "Now you do," Owen said. After the children were in bed, Jennie poured him a second cup of coffee and sat across the table from him, and they talked. It was the kind of talk that happens when two people who are both generally careful find themselves, unexpectedly, somewhat at ease. She told him about Thomas, not with grief but with the matter-of-fact honesty of someone who had found a way to hold a loss and continue living alongside it. Thomas had been a good man, she said, kind and hardworking and not given to dramatics, which she had valued greatly. He had died of a fever in August of 1872, quickly, which was its own particular kind of shock, the absence of warning. He had been 31 years old. Owen listened without interjecting, which she seemed to appreciate. "What brings you to Hayes City?" she asked. "The storm in part," he said. "Work, I've been moving around for a while." "Where from?" "Pennsylvania originally, long time ago." "What takes a man from Pennsylvania to Kansas?" He thought about that for a moment, about the particular sequence of things, the war and the years after, and the restlessness that had never entirely resolved. "A series of decisions that each seemed reasonable at the time," he said. She looked at him. "That's a careful answer." "It's an honest one." "Most careful answers are not honest ones," she said. "I notice you made it the exception." He felt something shift in him, a kind of recognition, the particular sensation of being seen by someone who is paying attention rather than simply looking. "I was in the war," he said. "When it was over, I found I didn't fit back into where I had been. I knew carpentry, I knew horses, the West had need of both." She was quiet for a moment. "Thomas was in the war too," she said. Missouri sighed. "He didn't talk about it much." "Most men don't." "You don't either." "No," he agreed. There was a silence that was comfortable in the way that silences between people who have found a common frequency can be comfortable. The lamp on the table made the kitchen warm and amber-lit, and outside the October wind moved through the grass with a sound like something breathing, and Owen became aware with a clarity that was slightly alarming that he did not want to leave. "I should let you get back to town," Jennie said, which was the same thought expressed as a practical conclusion rather than a wish. He stood. He put on his coat. He took his hat from the hook by the door. She stood in the doorway to see him out, and there was a moment, very brief, when they were close enough that he could see the fine lines at the corners of her gray eyes, and the particular set of her mouth that he was beginning to understand was not severity but precision, a woman who chose her expressions the way she chose her words, with care. "Thank you," she said, "for today. I'll see you in the morning." He walked to where he had tied Calhoun and rode back into town in the dark, and the clear Kansas sky overhead was enormous and full of stars, and he did not think about Pennsylvania or Dodge City or where he was going next, which was unusual because he always thought about where he was going next. He thought about gray eyes and selenite and stew made from dried vegetables and salt pork that had tasted, for reasons he could not entirely explain, like something worth coming home to. He was back at first light. The second day on the roof was different from the first. The structural work was done, and what remained was the careful, repetitive, satisfying work of shingling, which goes faster with company and is also the kind of work that allows for conversation. Jennie appeared on the roof. He looked at her when he heard her on the ladder. She was wearing the work trousers again, and she had a hammer in her hand. You don't need to, he began. You cannot lay shingles as fast with one person as with two, she said, settling herself on the planking with a practiced ease that told him she had been on this roof before. Show me the pattern you are using. He showed her. She caught on in about 30 seconds and matched his pace within 10 minutes, and they worked in a rhythm that developed naturally and without discussion, moving across the roof in sections, the tap of hammers alternating in a way that had the quality of something practiced rather than something new. They talked as they worked. It was easier somehow, face-on work between them, both of them looking at the roof rather than at each other, and things were said that might not have been said across a table. She told him about coming west from Missouri, she and Thomas, and the first winter in Kansas, which had been brutal, and how they had nearly left but had decided one more season, and how that one more season had been good enough to root them here. She told him about the corn and the kitchen garden, and the way the light came across the plains in the late afternoon in summer, low and golden and so vast it made you feel both very small and very present. And he listened to her describe it, and felt that he knew exactly what she meant because he had seen it too. He told her about Dodge City, about the cattle drives and the men you met on them, the strange temporary brotherhood of a trail drive, and how he had found in that kind of work a feeling of purpose and motion that had been harder to find after the war, and how after 2 seasons he had begun to feel that motion and purpose were not quite the same thing as belonging. She looked at him sidelong when he said that. What does belonging look like to you? She asked, not with any particular implication in the question, just the direct curiosity that was characteristic of her. He thought about it honestly. I am not sure I have seen it up close, he said. But I think it looks like having a reason to know where you will be a year from now. She hammered a shingle in silence for a moment. Thomas used to say a man who knows where he will be is a man who has made his bets, she said. He meant it as a compliment. It is one. She glanced at him. He was watching his work, not her, and she looked at his profile for a moment, the strong nose and the set jaw and the dark amber quality of his eyes in the morning light, and she felt something she had not expected to feel and had not prepared herself to manage, a warmth that was specific rather than general, directed rather than ambient, aimed at this particular man and no one else. She looked back at her work. By noon the roof was done. Not just the repairs but the entire eastern slope, which he had taken further than the damage strictly required, because the original shingles on the undamaged sections had been aging toward failure and might not have survived another winter, and she had enough cedar shingles left from the bundle for the purpose. He told her this as a practical statement of fact, not as an explanation requiring her approval, and she accepted it the same way, practically, as something that made sense. They sat on the peak of the roof when it was finished, in the way you can sit when the work is done and the surface is solid, and the October sun is on you, and there is no particular reason to rush back down. The Kansas plains spread out in every direction, brown and gold and enormous, the grass moving in long waves under the wind, and the town of Hays City was a small collection of shapes in the middle distance, and above them the sky was the deep, absolute blue that October produces on the plains, the kind of blue that has a quality of statement about it. It's a good roof, Owen said. It's a better roof than the original, Jennie said. She was quiet for a moment. You spent money on those materials. I did. I want to know the cost. Jennie, Owen. She turned to look at him directly. I am not going to let you absorb the cost of my roof. I know I have eaten your meals and I know I am grateful for what you have done, but I need to know the number so I can arrange to repay it when I am able. He looked at her. He thought about arguing and then thought about who he was arguing with and decided against it. $42, he said. But there is no urgency on it. There is urgency on it for me, she said. I will have 20 in the spring when I sell the winter grain, the rest by summer. All right, he said. Thank you, she said. And then after a pause, for all of it, the way you did it. He knew what she meant. The way he had not asked her to accept anything, had not looked at her with that expression, had simply come and done the work in the way you do work that matters, steadily and well. "You make it easy," he said, "to help without it feeling like helping. That is the most useful thing anyone has said to me since Thomas died," she said very quietly, and there was something in her voice that was different from her usual precision, something that had a slight unsteadiness to it, like a carefully maintained structure that had just briefly shifted in its foundations. He looked at her. She was looking out over the plains with her chin up and her jaw set, and her gray eyes bright with something she was not going to allow herself to shed. And he thought she was extraordinary in the specific way that things are extraordinary when they have endured genuinely difficult things, and emerged not diminished but refined. He did not reach for her hand. It was too soon, and she would not have wanted that, and he had enough sense to know the difference between a feeling and an action. But he was aware of her hand on the shingles beside his, 6 inches away, and of the October wind between them, and of the particular quality of sitting beside someone you want to sit beside. "Clara told me this morning that the crow came back," he said. Jennie laughed. It was a sudden, genuine sound, unguarded, and it changed her face completely, opening it up from its habitual precision into something that was simply delighted, and he felt the sound of it in his chest like a bell struck cleanly. "She has named him," Jennie said. "His name is apparently Harold." "Harold," Owen repeated. "She has given him a detailed history. He lost his wife in the storm, and now he is looking for hardtack to console himself. A sympathetic character." "She is a sympathetic child," Jennie said, and the warmth in her voice when she spoke about Clara was the warmth of someone who had so much of it and no particular place to put it, and he heard that too. He left in the afternoon. He climbed down the ladder and collected his tools and loaded them in the wagon, and Jennie stood on the ground and watched him do it, and he was aware of a heaviness in the leaving that was new and specific, and which he did not know what to do with. "Are you moving on?" she asked. She asked it carefully, without particular emphasis, the way you ask a question when the answer matters and you are not ready to show that it matters. "I had planned to," he said. He kept his hands busy with the tools and his eyes on what he was doing, which was partly practical and partly cowardice, and he acknowledged that. "There's work in Ellsworth. I'd heard about it before I came through." "I see," she said. The precision was back in her voice, the careful flatness. He began. "You do not owe me anything," she said. "You have done more than, you do not owe me anything, Owen." "I know I don't owe you anything," he said, and now he did look at her directly, with the full honesty that he had decided this woman deserved, and that the situation seemed to require. "That is not why I was going to say whatever I was going to say." She looked back at him. The gray eyes were very steady and very direct, and he thought that if he had been a less honest man, this moment would have been easier. "What were you going to say?" she asked. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at her. "That I do not particularly want to leave," he said. The silence was long and full and had a quality of held breath. "The Hendersons need a barn rebuilt," Jennie said finally. "I know because Reverend Calloway was talking about it this morning. It is real work, not just repair. It would take a couple of weeks. A barn raising," he said, "that is real work. The Hendersons would pay," she said. "Tom Henderson is a fair man. I could speak to him." "You could," she said, and the precision was not entirely gone from her voice, but there was something else in it now, something careful and warm and slightly frightened, which on Jennie Bristol was more moving than an open declaration would have been on anyone else. "I will speak to him tomorrow," Owen said. She nodded. "I will have breakfast ready at 7 if you want to stop before you go out to the Henderson place." 7, he said. "Yes." He drove away. He got to the end of the road and stopped Calhoun and sat for a moment looking back at the house, at the new cedar shingles bright on the roof in the late afternoon light, and he thought, a couple of weeks. A couple of weeks is a start. He turned Calhoun toward town. What followed was something neither of them had a name for yet, which was perhaps why it was allowed to develop as naturally as it did, without the pressure of naming or the obligation of declaring. Owen came for breakfast at 7 every morning. He went to the Henderson place and worked through the days building the barn, which was indeed real work, and which Tom Henderson paid him fairly for. In the evenings he came back to Jennie's for supper, sometimes, not every night, enough nights that it became a pattern without having been agreed upon as one. Clara adopted him with the comprehensive enthusiasm she brought to all her projects, including Harold the Crow. She explained things to him at length, the properties of various types of grass, the correct way to braid hair on a doll, the injustice of being 7 when Sela's was 9, the relative merits of cornbread versus biscuits. Owen listened to all of it with the same genuine attention he gave to everything, and Clara, who was a perceptive child beneath her brightness, understood that his interest was real and loved him for it. Sela's was slower and more deliberate in his assessment, which was his mother's way, and Owen did not push it. He let Sela's come to him when Sela's was ready, and in the meantime treated the boy with the same straightforward respect he gave everyone. He taught him 2 things, how to identify rock types and how to set a nail cleanly. Sela's took both seriously and the distance between them, which had not been hostility exactly, but the particular caution of a boy who had been his mother's primary protection for 14 months, and was not certain about this tall, quiet man who came to breakfast, shortened and eventually closed. The moment it closed was specific and quiet, and Owen did not mark it because it did not need marking. He and Sela's were in the barn one afternoon, Owen checking on the horse Jennie kept, a steady dun mare named Josephine, and Sela's was there too, feeding Josephine a piece of dried apple. Sela's said without preamble, "My pa couldn't whistle, but he could make bird calls." Then, "Can you whistle?" Owen whistled. Sela's assessed the result. "That is pretty good," Sela's said. "Papa could not do that at all." "What bird calls?" Owen asked. "A meadowlark mostly, sometimes a red-tailed hawk." "Can you do them?" "Some." "Teach me." So Sela's taught him in the dusty barn light, with Josephine watching benignly over her dried apple, and something settled between them that afternoon, easy and permanent. Jennie watched all of this. She watched it with the careful attention she gave everything, and with a feeling in her chest that was complicated and new, layered, in the way that feelings are when they involve not just yourself but your children. When love is not only about what you want, but about what is right for the people who depend on you. She had loved Thomas completely and truly, and that love had not gone anywhere after he died. It had simply transformed into something she carried rather than shared, a private archive. What she felt when she watched Owen on her roof, at her table in her barn with her son, was different from that in some ways and similar in others, and the similarity was what both frightened and moved her. She did not say anything about it. She watched him and she was warm with him and she let him come back for breakfast, and she took note, privately, of the particular way her kitchen felt when he was in it. The way the ordinary morning things, the coffee pot and the eggs and the bread cooling on the board, seemed more solid and specific in his presence, as though attention made things real. 2 weeks became 3. The Henderson barn was finished and Tom Henderson shook Owen's hand and said there was a fence line that needed replacing if he was interested, and Owen said he was interested. A month passed. The October cold deepened toward November and the plains turned from gold to the pale gray-brown of the dormant season, and in the evenings there was fire in the stove, and the smell of whatever Jennie was cooking, and the particular enclosed warmth of a house that had good new shingles overhead and a family inside it. Owen moved out of the boarding house. He moved into the small room above the livery stable, which was cheaper and also louder but which was closer to the Bristol property by half a mile, which was not a coincidence, and which he did not pretend was one, at least to himself. Mrs. Pierce said nothing to him when he settled his account, but she gave him an extra slice of pie and a look that communicated a thorough awareness of exactly what was happening, which he bore with as much dignity as possible. It was in November that Hayes City demonstrated to Owen one of the less admirable qualities of small western towns in the 1870s, which was the cheerful and often punishing interest that the community took in the private arrangements of its members. The fact of Owen Doyle eating supper at Jennie Bristol's house became a topic of general discussion at a speed and thoroughness that surprised him, though it perhaps should not have. He heard about it first from Tom Henderson, who mentioned it in the sideways, apparently casual manner of a man relaying information he has been asked to relay. "People are talking," Tom said, without elaboration. "People are always talking," Owen said. "About you and the widow Bristol," Tom said. "About whether it is appropriate." Owen set down his saw and looked at Tom Henderson, who had the slightly uncomfortable look of a man being both honest and somewhat apologetic. "What exactly is being said?" Owen asked, because he wanted to know the specific shape of it. "That you are spending a lot of time at her house, and that a woman in her position needs to be careful of her reputation," Tom said. "And some are saying that you are taking advantage of her vulnerability." Owen was quiet for a moment, sorting out which of these statements made him angry and why. The first one frustrated him because it was the kind of thinking that treated a woman's reputation as more important than her welfare. And the second one made him genuinely angry because it was precisely wrong about who was taking advantage of whom, if that word applied at all to a situation that was simply two adults finding their way toward each other. "I will speak to Reverend Calloway," he said. "You do not have to." "I know I do not have to," Owen said, with the quiet firmness Jennie had apparently transferred to him by proximity. He spoke to Reverend Calloway that evening. The Reverend was not unsympathetic, being a man who understood the mechanics of small-town concern and also the genuine human situation before him, but he was honest. "There are those who think you should either make your intentions clear or step back," he said. "I am not saying I agree. I am telling you what is being said." Owen thanked him and went home, and that night he lay awake in the loft above the livery for a long time thinking about intentions and what it meant to make them clear, and what he actually wanted with the particular clarity that solitude and honesty require. What he wanted was not complicated, it was only large. He wanted the breakfast table, and the crow named Harold and the selenite in the window, and the woman who argued about who was going to pay for the roof, and climbed up to it anyway. He wanted the feeling he had every morning driving out to the Bristol property that was a version of coming home, a feeling he had not had in so long he had almost stopped believing he would know it when it arrived. He had not said any of this to Jennie. He thought about why he had not. Some of it was the care he had for her, the awareness that she had been through a loss that had reformed her at a fundamental level, and that any man who moved too fast with her was not caring for her properly. Some of it was the specific texture of his uncertainty, not about what he felt but about whether what he felt was wanted. She was warm with him. She laughed with him. She had kept him coming back, had found the Henderson job, had made the arrangements that gave him reasons to stay. But Jennie Bristol was a woman who managed things, who arranged for outcomes she needed, and he was not entirely certain whether he was an outcome she needed or something else. He needed to know. The next morning he came at 7 as usual. The children ate and went out, Clara to walk to the schoolhouse and Sela's with her. Jennie poured herself a second cup of coffee and sat down, which was her habit when they had time to talk, and Owen sat across from her, and she looked at him with her gray eyes and said, with her usual directness, "Something is on your mind." "Yes," he said. "What is it?" He looked at her. He had prepared a careful version of this, a measured and thoughtful approach that acknowledged her autonomy and stated his feelings without pressure. But in the actual moment, sitting across from Jennie Bristol in her kitchen with the November light coming through the clean window glass and the coffee between them, the careful version seemed insufficient. "I want to stay," he said. "Not in Hayes City generally, here. I want to stay here with you and Sela's and Clara. I want that to be the thing, the place and the people I come back to. I am saying this clearly because I think you deserve clarity and because I have been not saying it for a month and it is not something I can manage to keep not saying." The kitchen was very quiet. Jenny looked at him for a long time, and he looked back and did not qualify or retreat. "Owen," she said, and her voice had that slight unsteadiness in it again, the crack in the precision. "You can tell me no," he said, "or that it is too soon, or that you are not interested, and I will have heard it clearly and I will respect it fully. But I needed you to know, because not saying it felt like a kind of dishonesty, and I am not interested in being dishonest with you." She set down her coffee cup. She looked at her hands, flat on the table, and then at him. "It is not too soon," she said carefully. "And I am interested, very much interested, which is the part that I have been trying to manage quietly, because I do not know how to have this feeling and also protect my children from what happens if this feeling does not." She stopped, pressed her lips together. Then, with a kind of courage that he recognized as costing her something, "I am afraid," she said, "of caring very much and losing it again. That is the truth." He reached across the table. His hand covered hers, both of hers, completely, and she looked down at it and then up at him. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to not be afraid. I'm asking you to let me be the kind of person who makes it easier to bear." She was silent for a moment. Then she turned her hand over under his and held it, and that was her answer, not a word but something more conclusive than words, the warm, solid grip of a woman who had decided. He felt it as a thing that unlocked him. A door he had not known was shut. They sat like that for a while, her hand in both of his, the coffee getting cold, the November light on the floor, and it was the sort of moment that is both entirely ordinary and entirely not, that has no drama in it but contains everything important. "I should tell you something," Owen said after a while. "Tell me." "I have a small amount of money put aside. I have been putting it aside for a long time with the intention of eventually acquiring a piece of land. I have about $300. He paused. "That is enough to buy the parcel east of your property, the one that has been fallow since the Latimer family left." Jenny went still. He felt her stillness through her hand. "I'm not saying that to press you toward anything," he said quickly. "I am saying it because I want you to know that staying is not a temporary thought, that I have been thinking about it in a practical way, not just a feeling. The parcel east of here would give me a place of my own to establish that is near to you without. If you bought the parcel east of my property," Jenny said slowly, "you would be my neighbor." "Yes, that is a very appropriate arrangement." "Yes, it is." She looked at him with a faint, private smile, the specific smile she had that she did not produce often and which, when it appeared, was something he could feel in every part of himself. "Owen Doyle," she said, "you are the most careful man I have ever met." "You made care seem worthwhile," he said. She laughed, soft and real. He thought he would spend the rest of his life arranging for that sound. He spoke to the land agent that week. The Latimer parcel was available and the price was within what he had, barely, with enough remaining for seed and some basic materials. He signed the papers and received the deed with the quiet satisfaction of a man making a permanent bet for the first time in a long time. He told Jenny that evening. She looked at the deed and then at him and said nothing, but she put her hand on his arm in a way that she had not touched him before, a kind of claiming that was conscious and deliberate, and that made the deed seem suddenly less significant than the hand. The weeks that followed were the best weeks of Owen Doyle's life, which he would have found difficult to have predicted a year earlier when he was riding cattle trails out of Dodge City with nothing in particular waiting for him anywhere. He worked his parcel in the mornings, breaking the fallow ground for spring planting, and came to Jenny's in the evenings, and on Sundays they went to church together, which was understood by the town as a declaration without requiring any formal announcement. Reverend Calloway looked satisfied, which Owen bore with equanimity. Mrs. Pierce was openly delighted, which was harder to navigate only because her delight expressed itself in additional servings of food whenever Owen came into the boarding house for coffee, and he could not refuse without being rude. There was, in this period, a difficult evening. It came in late November, after a day when Owen had been in town, and had heard a conversation at the general store between two men. older men who had been in Hayes City since before it was properly a town, about the appropriateness of a widow with children taking up with a drifter of uncertain background who had appeared out of nowhere and might just as easily disappear back into it. The men had not known Owen was behind the store shelf, listening, and what they said was not cruel so much as the particular blunt dismissiveness of men who had decided opinions about how the world should work. Owen had not said anything. He had paid for his supplies and left. But the words had gotten under his skin in the way that words sometimes do when they touch something you are already uncertain about, when they find the exact shape of a doubt you have been managing. He was quiet that evening. Jennie noticed because Jennie noticed everything. After supper, after the children were in bed, she sat across from him and said, "What happened today?" he told her. He told her exactly what had been said and where and by whom, not to alarm her, but because she had asked, and because he had decided the night he held her hand across the table that he would not be less than honest with this woman about anything. She listened. Her expression during his account was the expression of someone whose opinion of the people involved had already been low and was now lower. "Henry Marsh," she said, identifying one of the men from his description. "His wife left him in 1869, and no one was surprised. And old Dunbar has not had a charitable thought about anyone since the Grant administration." "I am aware of that," Owen said. "But the thing they said, that I am a drifter of uncertain background who might disappear. You bought the land east of my property," Jennie said. "I know. A man who is going to disappear does not buy land." "I know that too," he said. "The thing is, they were not entirely. I have been a drifter. That is not a false description of what I have been, and I think you deserve to be with someone who does not bring doubt along with him." Jennie looked at him steadily. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but entirely certain. "Thomas was the most settled man I have ever known, and he died at 31, she said. "There is no kind of man who does not bring uncertainty with him. What you brought is a new roof and a fair mind, and a way of being with my children that makes Sela's stand taller and Clara laugh more. And you sat at this table for a month talking to me like I was worth listening to, which is a thing I had missed very much. I do not care what Henry Marsh thinks. I never have." Owen looked at her. The lamp was between them, warm and amber, and her face was serious and direct and entirely open in the way it only was in moments like this when she had decided to give him something without armoring it. "Jennie," he said. "Do not thank me," she said. "I am not saying it to comfort you. I am saying it because it is true." "I know," he said. "I was not going to thank you." "What were you going to say?" He looked at her. He thought of all the ways to say it and found that only the plainest one seemed adequate. "I love you," he said. "That is what I was going to say." The words were very quiet in the room. They sat there between them like something that had been growing in the dark and had now been brought into the light, solid and irreversible. Jennie's expression shifted in a way he had not seen before, the precision falling away entirely, leaving something that was younger and older at the same time, open and certain and very moved. "I love you too," she said. "I have been trying to say it properly for 3 weeks and I could not find the right time. This seems like a fine time." "It does," she agreed. He reached for her hand and she gave it, and they sat in the warm light with December cold pressing at the windows, and everything between them finally said, and neither of them needed to fill the silence after that, which is how you know the silence is the right kind. He asked her to marry him on a Tuesday in December, not in a dramatic setting but in the barn, which was where they happened to be when the moment arrived. Jennie checking on Josephine and Owen having come to find her because he had a question and had realized, standing in the barn door watching her brush the mare with that efficient unself-conscious care, that the question was more urgent than he had planned for, and that he was not willing to wait for a more formal occasion. He did not have a ring. He had been saving for one but had not yet purchased it. "I will have a ring before Christmas," he said. "I wanted to ask now because I could not manage to wait." Jennie looked at him over Josephine's back with her gray eyes very bright. "You are asking me to marry you in my barn," she said. "I am." "Without a ring?" "Yes." "On a Tuesday?" "Jennie," he said. "Yes," she said, simply and completely, and with a smile so full and unguarded he felt it change the temperature of the barn. "Yes, obviously yes, Owen." He came around the horse and she met him, and he kissed her for the first time in the smell of hay and horses in the December cold. And she held the front of his coat with both hands and kissed him back with the particular combination of restraint and intensity that was entirely her, precise even in this, deliberate and complete. Josephine observed all of this with the philosophical equanimity of a good horse. They were married in the Hayes City Church on a Saturday in January of 1874, the first month of the new year, which felt appropriate to both of them, a beginning at a beginning. Reverend Calloway performed the ceremony with barely contained satisfaction. Mrs. Pierce cried, which surprised no one. Clara was the self-appointed supervisor of floral arrangements, producing a bouquet of dried prairie flowers and cedar sprigs that she presented to her mother with enormous solemnity. Silas stood beside Owen as his witness with his jaw set in the determined way he had, and when Reverend Calloway pronounced them husband and wife, Owen looked down and saw that Silas was blinking hard and quickly, and he put his hand briefly on the boy's shoulder, just briefly, and felt Silas's hand come up and grip his arm and hold it. Tom Henderson and his wife were there. Several of the families Owen had worked for over the previous 2 months were there. Henry Marsh was not there, and Owen did not notice his absence. The ring was silver, which was what Hayes City had to offer, set with a small piece of garnet that the jeweler in town had sourced from a trader passing through. Jennie looked at it on her hand in the January light coming through the church windows, and then up at Owen with an expression that was both private and entirely clear. And he thought that if the whole of his life before this moment had been simply the movement toward this one, it had been a journey worth making. Spring came to Kansas with the extravagance it always employs after a difficult winter, arriving in April with an almost aggressive abundance, green pressing up through the mud, the prairie grass coming back with the same insistent life it had every year, indifferent to whatever winter had done and committed only to the project of being alive. Owen planted his parcel and Jennie's fields together, the two properties working as a single operation, which made economic and practical sense, and which neither of them needed to discuss at length because it was obviously correct. He had sold the small plot back to the land office at a small profit when they married, the formal delineation between properties becoming irrelevant, and the combined acreage gave them a real farm, substantial enough to carry a family and build something over time. Silas worked alongside him in the fields and did not complain and learned everything Owen taught him with the same serious thoroughness he brought to rock collection and bird calls. He was 10 now and growing fast, and there was a conversation between him and Owen one April evening that Owen kept near the center of himself for the rest of his life. They were returning from the far edge of the field at day's end, both of them tired and muddy, and Silas had been quiet in the thoughtful way he sometimes was, working something out internally before presenting it. "Owen," Silas said. "Yes. Is it all right if I call you Papa sometimes?" Owen stopped walking. He looked down at Silas, at his mother's gray eyes and his father's jaw, and the specific combination that was entirely his own. "Yes," he said, with a fullness in his throat that made the word simpler than he had expected it to be. "That is very all right with me." Silas nodded once, having received the answer satisfied. "All right," he said, then, "also I found another rock I want to show you." "Show me after supper," Owen said. "Yes, sir," Silas said. Owen walked the rest of the way to the house in the low golden light of a Kansas April with his eyes on the place where the new cedar shingles caught the sun and burned copper and warm against the sky. And he thought about a morning in October when he had driven a wagon out here before dawn and unloaded timber in the dark, and about all the mornings after that, and about the specific gift of a life that has, after a long journey, found its location. Summer arrived, and with it the particular dense richness of a Kansas growing season. Long hot days and blue skies, and the corn coming up strong along the south fields. The kitchen garden producing abundantly under Jennie's management. The children brown from the sun, and louder than they had been in the quiet months after Thomas died. The house was different now, fuller in every dimension, louder and more complicated and more alive. And if there was a ghost of Thomas Bristol in the room sometimes, in Silas's jaw or Clara's laugh or the pine timber of the original structure, it was not an unwelcome ghost. It was the ghost of someone who had built something good and then left too soon, and what had been built on top of it was its continuation, not its replacement. Owen understood this, and he thought Jennie did too, and they did not need to discuss it to understand it. In August of 1874, Jennie told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen in the early morning, after the children had gone out, and her expression when she told him was the complicated expression of someone who is very happy and slightly terrified, and managing both with characteristic precision. Owen sat with it for a moment, not because he was uncertain about how he felt, but because how he felt was large and needed a moment to fully occupy the space available. "Are you well?" he asked. "Very well," she said. "I am always well when I am expecting. Thomas used to say I was my most formidable when I was expecting because I had no patience for nonsense." "That is useful to know," Owen said, and she laughed. He crossed the kitchen and held her, not dramatically but completely, his arms around her and her head briefly against his shoulder, before she straightened up in the way. She always did because there were things to be done. But in the moment before she straightened, he felt her hold him back with a grip that was very secure, the grip of someone who is holding something they mean to keep. The child was born in April of 1875, in the early morning hours during an unseasonable thunderstorm that rolled across the plains with the atmospheric irony of something that had been planned. Owen sat outside the bedroom door listening to the sounds from inside while Silas and Clara slept in the loft, and he did not think about anything except being here and the sound of Jennie's breathing through the wall and the storm outside. And when the small, definitive cry came, and Mrs. Pierce opened the door with a lamp in her hand and her face transformed with satisfaction, he stood up and went in. It was a boy. He was red and objecting loudly, and had Owen's dark hair and some arrangement of features that was too new to be anybody's yet. Jennie held him with the practiced ease of someone who had done this before and looked up at Owen with her gray eyes entirely open, the armor down, the precision gone, just her face and the joy in it. "Well," she said. "Well," he said, "he needs a name." "What do you want to name him?" She looked at him steadily. "Thomas," she said. "I would like to name him Thomas Owen Bristol Doyle, if that is all right with you." Owen looked at his wife and his son, and the lamp burning steady in the bedroom while the storm moved away across the prairie, and he thought about how a name can hold two things at once, how a life can be both a continuation and a new start, how love does not run out when there is more of it to give. "That is more than all right," he said. He sat on the edge of the bed beside her and held his son, who weighed almost nothing and smelled of new life, and was already conducting an investigation of Owen's face with the unfocused seriousness of the very recently born. "He looks skeptical," Owen said. "He is definitely my child," Jennie said. From the loft they heard the sound of Clara's feet hitting the floor and then Silas's because the cry had woken them, or perhaps the storm had, and then small feet on the ladder and Clara's face appearing at the doorway with an expression of combined excitement and enormous proprietary satisfaction. "Is it here?" Clara demanded. "He is here," Jennie said. Clara considered this. "All right, I was hoping for a brother." She came to look. "He is very small." "You were very small," Jennie said. "I was not," Clara said, with the dignity that was her signature response to any suggestion of having been less than fully capable. Silas came in quietly behind his sister and looked at the baby with the same careful assessment he brought to important things. Owen held the baby toward him, and Silas looked at the small bundled face for a long moment. Thomas, Silas said, trying the name. Thomas Owen Bristol Doyle, Owen said. Silas looked at him. Something moved across the boy's face that was private and complete. That's a good name, he said. The summer that followed was the best summer Owen could remember, which was saying something because his memories of good summers were sparse and intermittent, the good ones scattered between the long years of hard ones. He had a farm that was working, land that was producing, a house with a new roof that held in every kind of weather and was, as he had promised, better than the original. He had a wife who matched him in everything and exceeded him in several things, and who he found, each morning, had become in his sleep the person he most wanted to see. He had a daughter who explained the world to him at length and with authority. He had a son who was becoming the man his father had tried to make possible, and who had, Owen thought, a better shot at it than most because he was not doing it alone. He had a child named Thomas in a cradle in the bedroom who woke too early and objected to the indignity of having needs and was, by universal agreement, the best thing that had happened to the Bristol Doyle household since the new shingles. In the fall of 1875, a year after Thomas Owen was born, Owen built an addition to the house. It was not strictly necessary, but it was right. An extra room off the north side that would eventually be Silas's room when he was old enough to want privacy, and which in the meantime served as a proper parlor so that the kitchen could be only the kitchen and the family could sit in the evenings without being in each other's constant proximity, which was a luxury that 4 people and an increasingly mobile baby made desirable. He built it in the way he built everything, carefully and well, with good timber and clean joints, and the patient eye of someone who knows that a thing built right does not need to be built again. Jennie helped on the weekends, as she had helped on the roof, handing materials and asking good questions about the structural decisions and occasionally offering a better approach, which was usually the better approach, and which he incorporated without ego because he had long since established that his ego had no useful role in a conversation with Jennie Bristol. Silas helped too, now 11 and capable of real work, and there were 3 or 4 Saturdays of hammer and saw, and the smell of fresh timber and Clara narrating from the ground level, and Thomas pulling himself upright against anything available and surveying the construction with an expression of academic interest. And it was the kind of ordinary domestic richness that is difficult to articulate to someone who has not had it, and that people who have it sometimes fail to notice. Owen noticed. He was constitutionally unable, having gone without for so long, to take for granted the specific weight of his son in his arms or the particular sound of Jennie's voice reading to the children at night, the firelight on the walls and the smell of October coming through the window, autumn again, the season that had started this. The roof above them was solid and sure. He knew because he had built it himself, in 2 days in October of 1873, before he had any idea this would become his life. He had built it for a woman who had not asked for help, and he had left before she could thank him, driven away in the late afternoon with the cedar shingles bright on her house and something warm in his chest that he had not known how to name. He knew what to name it now. One evening in October of 1875, 2 years after the storm, Jennie came and found him standing in the yard in the blue dusk, looking at the roof. She came and stood beside him with Thomas on her hip, the baby warm and heavy, almost asleep, head drooping toward his mother's shoulder. "What are you looking at?" she asked. "The roof," he said. She looked at it too. The cedar shingles were weathering to a silver brown, the way cedar does, taking on a quality of having been there always, a permanence that was not flashy but was entirely reliable. "It's a good roof," she said. "It is. You built it before you had any reason to." "I had a reason," he said. "It was just simpler than the ones I have now." She leaned against him, her shoulder to his arm, Thomas's small weight between them, and they looked at the house in the evening light, at the walls that had not moved in the storm and the roof that had been rebuilt, and the addition off the north side where the lamp was burning in the new parlor. "When Reverend Calloway came to my door," she said, "and I sent him away, I told myself I would manage, and I believed it. I would have managed." "I know you would have," Owen said. "But this is better," she said. "This is considerably better than managing." He put his arm around her carefully to include Thomas without waking him. Jennie settled in against his side with the ease of long habit and the warmth of chosen proximity. The October sky above them was darkening toward stars, the great Kansas sky that had been overhead the whole time, over the storm and the repair and the careful beginning, and all the growing that had followed, indifferent and enormous and beautiful. In the years that came after, Hays City grew. The railroad brought more people and more commerce, and the wild, ungoverned energy of the early 1870s settled gradually into something that was still the West but was becoming also a community, a place with schools and churches and a newspaper, and the slow accumulating weight of people who had decided to stay. Owen's farm prospered in the modest, real way that honest work and good land produce prosperity, not spectacularly but consistently, year on year. He had a reputation in the county as a man who could build anything and build it right, and in the quieter seasons between planting and harvest, he took carpentry work for neighbors, which added to their income and kept his hands occupied. He was known as a fair man and a hard worker and a good neighbor, which were the categories that mattered in Hays City in 1876 and beyond. Jennie ran the farm with him as an equal partner in the full sense, managing the accounts and the kitchen garden and the schooling of the children and the 1,000 decisions of the domestic enterprise with the same capable attention she had always brought to everything. She was, he thought on a regular basis, the most competent person he had ever known, which was saying something given that he had known some very competent people. She had started in the spring of 1876 to teach reading and writing to a small group of children whose families did not have easy access to the schoolhouse. She did this on Sunday afternoons in the parlor, 4 or 5 children at a time, teaching from the same reader she used with Silas and Clara. It was not something she announced or made a project of. She simply did it because it needed doing and she could do it. Owen watched her in these sessions sometimes through the parlor window, watched her crouch down beside a child, finger on the page, saying words in that patient, precise voice, and he felt the same thing he had felt the first time he watched her on her roof in Thomas's work trousers, assessing storm damage with the calm of someone who faced things directly, the feeling of someone extraordinary being themselves. Their second child, another boy named William, arrived in the winter of 1877, arriving quickly and with considerably less drama than Thomas Owen had, as though he had been briefed on the household's preference for efficiency. He was a serene child with Jennie's gray eyes and a disposition of considerable amiability that Jennie said was entirely Owen's and Owen said was entirely hers, and they did not resolve the question because it did not need to be resolved. With 4 children between them, the house which had been ruined and then repaired and then extended became something even more than a home. It became the particular kind of full and busy and warm place that is evidence of a life working as it should, of things having come together in the way they are meant to, with ordinary grace and real love. Silas turned 16 in 1878 and was already close to Owen's height, already beginning to look at the land with the eyes of someone planning for it. And Owen had a conversation with him one autumn evening about what he wanted, and Silas said he wanted to farm, wanted this land, wanted to learn everything about it, and Owen said there was no one he would rather teach and meant it completely. Clara at 14 was her mother's daughter and her own person simultaneously, bright and certain and opinionated about everything, with Jennie's precision and a warmth that was all her own. She had decided she wanted to be a teacher, a proper one with training, and she had already written a letter to an institution in Kansas City inquiring about possibilities, which she had written herself, without asking for help or announcing it in advance, and had simply presented to her parents one evening already sealed and addressed. Jennie had looked at the letter, and then at her daughter with an expression that Owen recognized as the one she wore when something was both expected and still surprising. "I will cover the postage," Jennie had said. "I know you will," Clara said, with the serene confidence of someone who has never doubted her mother's support for anything that mattered. On an evening in the fall of 1878, 5 years after the storm, Owen and Jennie sat on the front step of the house after the children were in bed, in the way they often did in the mild evenings when the days were getting shorter but had not yet turned cold. Jennie was mending something. She was always mending something, and Owen had a cup of coffee and was watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky in the specific way he had watched them since he was a boy in Pennsylvania, which was a long time ago and a long way from here. "Are you content?" Jennie asked, not looking up from her mending. "Yes," he said. He thought about elaborating and decided the word was complete in itself. "Then are you?" She was quiet for a moment. He watched her hands on the fabric, the capable, certain hands of a woman who did things and knew how to do them. Then she looked up and out at the dark prairie and the stars and the enormous quiet that was the Kansas night, and she said, "Yes, more than I knew was possible." He reached over and covered her hand with his, the way he had the first time across the kitchen table, and she turned her hand over and held his, the way she had the first time, the warm, sure grip of a woman who had decided. And they sat in the fall dark while the coyotes called somewhere in the far grass, and the house behind them was warm with sleeping children, and the cedar shingles overhead were solid against the sky. He thought about a morning in October 5 years ago, a gray dawn, driving out here before anyone was awake with a wagon load of timber, and no plan beyond the simple certainty that a woman with 2 children and a ruined roof needed help, and that he was the person available to give it. And the woman had come to her door with her gray eyes and her careful voice and her formidable pride, and had looked at his wagon and at him and had said, "I will feed you breakfast." And he had said, 7 in the morning. And it had been 7 in the morning every day since, in all the ways that mattered. He had left before she could thank him on that first day, or thought he had, loaded up in the afternoon and driven away before she came out, not wanting the thanks, not wanting to make it complicated. And then she had sent a message to the boarding house that evening through Mrs. Pierce, very brief, saying, "Mr. Doyle, the roof is excellent. Breakfast at 7 if you are able. J. Bristol." He had been able. He was still able. He intended to remain able for every morning that remained to him, to wake in this house on this land that had become the whole map of the world that mattered, with this woman and these children, and to be present in it completely every day without taking it for granted even once. "Owen," Jennie said. "Yes." "Thank you," she said, "for the roof. I never did say it properly at the time." He looked at her. She was smiling, the full open smile that had changed her face the first time he saw it, and her gray eyes in the starlight were very clear. "You fed me breakfast," he said. "I did. Every morning for 5 years. "Yes." "Then we are even," he said. She laughed, soft and full in the autumn dark, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and above them the stars were out in their full October array, the ones he had watched from a dozen states and territories, and they had never looked to him before like they were exactly where he was standing, but they did now. They did now, and they did every night after that. The prairie grass moved in the wind with its perpetual sound of something alive and patient, and the house behind them was solid and warm and full of sleeping children, and the specific undramatic abundance of a life built carefully and together. And all of it, had begun with a storm and a ruined roof, and a woman who asked for nothing and a man who gave anyway, and the particular grace that sometimes finds its way into the space between 2 people who are paying honest attention to each other. It had grown from there, as things do when the root is sound. It had grown into everything.